So remember that.
Okay, in terms of the stuff, slight modification of deadlines. Any change, of course, push the deadlines back. Exam 1, deadline is October 26. Quizzes part 2, the last 2, deadline of 26 as well. If you're already done, you don't redo them, you're done. But if you haven't done them yet, there's still like another week. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th. Exam 5, assignment final, December 14th at noon, if you happen to need it. For the paper draft, November 9th, deadline +5, November 14th. Emergency deadline, November 21st. And the desperation deadline, December 8th. And these are turned in on the blackboard, and deadlines end of day. Before heading to looking at Taoism, heading to part 3, anything about the previous stuff that needs more stuff. All about stuffs.
What page are we on?
64.
Thank you.
64.
So, when we finished up last time, we were gazing upon the yin-yang symbol of Taoism, and we'll take a brief look at Taoism. The Tao Te Ching was credited to Lao Tzu, and there's, like with Homer, there's some considerable debate of whether Lao Tzu was an actual person who sat down and wrote the book, or whether it's a collection of works from various people, and it's attributed to Lao Tzu, again, like in the manner of Homer. Although there is a claim.
Tao.
Taoist?
Tao.
Yep.
No, that T-A-O.
Tao.
Tao.
Tao. If you pronounce the T as a D, then
Tao.
Yep.
You don't pronounce the IST?
Taoist.
Oh, you're down there.
Oh yeah, yeah. So Taoist, Tao, Tao.
Okay.
Yeah, so we don't know for sure if there actually was a Lao Tzu, although there's a story in which it's claimed that Confucius met Lao Tzu. They did battle upon a bridge. That'd be cool. There probably isn't a fighting game which involves that. So what's going on with the Tao? Well, one thing about the Tao Te Ching, if you look at it in terms of trying to find like laid out arguments, not so much. So we see in Plato and Aristotle, for example, arguing every single point. But in the case of the Tao Te Ching, not a great deal of the arguments laid out. Now in some Chinese philosophy there is argumentation, but here we mostly see description. And it's kind of like an appeal to intuition. The idea being that if you find this to make sense and seems appealing, then accept it as true. Now, rather than go through like every single point, and of course time is of the essence, I'll hit some of the high points of the Taoism. Now one thing of course is that even though it's called the Tao or the Way, it of course has many names but no names at all. There's a lot of, as you might imagine, that kind of stuff. We're talking about the Tao, seeming contradictions. Now one of the things, metaphors that Taoists like to use is comparing the Tao to water in terms of the way it works. If you want to get kind of a rough grasp on the Tao, at least from a Western perspective, this idea of the Tao was stolen by George Lucas and made into the Force. As you'll see, there'll be a lot of similarities between the two because George Lucas took the idea. Now, one of the metaphors that's commonly used of the Tao is to say that it's like water. Now, what are the qualities of water? It always flows
Downstream.
It always flows downstream, taking the easier path. If it runs into an obstacle, what does it do? Yeah, it goes around it. It doesn't, just keep whapping against it. Unless, of course, there's no other way, then it gradually wears it down. And so the Taoists take the way of water to be the way of the Tao, namely that it takes the easy path, and then if it encounters obstacles, rather than contest with them, it simply goes around them. Now this is presented in a positive light. I mean, one could present it negatively. The Tao is kind of lazy, always going downhill and avoiding things. But how could that be like good life advice? To take the way that is less difficult and not beat your head against obstacles.
What was the question?
Oh, how could that be good life advice?
Reduce stress in your life.
Yeah, yeah, if you have options of doing things, because the Taoists don't say don't do things, they say do things in the way that, you know, take, if there's an easier path to it, why just,
Work smart,
Yeah.
not hard.
yeah, work wise?
Mhm.
Yeah, why take the hard route? If you encounter an obstacle, why beat against it when you just go around it?
Mhm.
Yeah, it is, as you said, it's a stress-reducing philosophy. What people often want to do is, well, everyone knows someone like this, hopefully you're not that person. If there's like two choices, like interact with people in a way that causes confrontation and, you know, stress and doesn't get things done, or work with people as they are to get things done smoothly, some people always want to take the first option. They know what will set someone off, and they just gotta trigger that. The second comparison or metaphor is the Tao and emptiness. Now, normally, we think of emptiness as a bad thing. For example, what things are bad when they're empty? Or is bad empty? Yes, the empty tummy, but also in a way that's good, because if your tummy's empty, then you can eat something, eat that good meal. We often, of course, think about our bank account being bad, being empty, of course. But of course, there are some things whose use come from being empty, like, you know, the room. We couldn't use the room if it was not empty. We could not, if you think of like on your computer, your hard drive, you want to have a lot of empty space so you can put stuff in there. And so it is the emptiness, you know, that is useful. And so the Taoists say the Tao is like this emptiness. Now the Tao, of course, has all kinds of interesting qualities and capabilities and actions. Now one of the other sort of common descriptions of the Tao is that if you learn the way of the Tao and follow the way of the Tao, you'll become the wise person or the sage. And one key notion is doing without doing. What does that mean? Well, the idea is basically to do without doing doesn't mean that it's done by doing nothing. It's done with doing the minimal sort of effort. It's the idea is that the Tao always works with things the way they are, and thus accomplishes its goals, seemingly to do without doing. And it's, I believe, if my memory serves, the expression is wei wu wei.
Is what?
Wei wu wei.
Wei wu wei.
Wei wu wei.
Wei wu wei.
Wei wu wei. Do without doing. And if you possess this Tao, the idea would be that you would achieve that capacity to be able to know how things are, work with the natures of things, and you can do them without doing, without an unnatural effort. And again, you know, Lucas got the idea of the Force from this, and of course, in the, you know, the movies, you're able to like, you know, whack things with lightsabers and lift up X-wing fighters and stuff. And the Taoists don't promise that. But the idea is that if you know the nature of things, then it's, you can do things without extra effort. You know how things work. You don't have to contest or fight with it. Now the Taoists also have, it figures prominently in a lot of stories like the Journey to the East, etc., the notion of Taoist immortals that would live a long time. And it was believed that the Taoists had discovered the secret of immortality. And like every culture, the wealthy and emperors of China would seek eternal life, because everyone seeks that, not realizing that it's a curse, at least in the movies. So the Taoists have this reputation in part for the point you raised, namely, we know that stress kills. So if you have like a Taoist, you know, they advocated a very sort of simple lifestyle to do without doing, to avoid stress, and so they would tend to live longer, and so they were right about that. So that's a little bit of Taoism. Now we turn on to part 3. Okay, in part 3, we turn to minds, freedom, and causation. We'll begin with our good dead friend, Thomas Hobbes. Born in 1588, died in 1679, and is still super dead today. Now, he ended up being kind of unlucky, but then ultimately lucky. One of his major influences was the English Civil War, and he kept changing sides. Whenever he'd switch, his sides started losing, which is kind of important. But
That's pitiful.
it is pitiful. But in the end, he was lucky because the winner, like during his lifetime, was a former student who remembered him fondly, and so things ended up working out. He became a tutor for the family and avoided being executed. So that part was good.
He was just a cow.
Well, he was expedient. But it matched his political philosophy. Now, one of his main influences was the works of Galileo Galilei. Who was Galileo?
He's one of the first astronomers.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, he's a telescope guy.
yeah.
And Galileo put forth the notion that the world is matter in motion governed by math. I mean, this of course goes back to Democritus, but the idea being that you could have a system of physics in which it's moving objects and you have mathematics for them. And Hobbes liked that idea that you could explain the world as moving objects, moving matter, using mathematics. So a second influence was Euclidean geometry, in which you could do proofs. Now, he actually taught himself geometry, I think, like in his 40s, teaching you can teach an old Hobbes new tricks. And, yeah, geometry, I did very badly at geometry, which is unfortunate, because I think if I had known that you could conquer the world with geometry, I would have paid more attention. Now, his political influence was, of course, the English Civil War. The English were fighting over, in part, the divine right of kings, between having an absolute Catholic monarch versus a Protestant monarch, more limited, with a parliament. And of course, we know how that eventually turned out. You end up with a Protestant monarchy, ever decreasing influence and power, and a strong parliament and courts. His work, his great tour de force in philosophy, is of course the classic Leviathan. Also the title of a movie starring Peter Weller. It's probably the best of the alien movie clones. Basically Alien underwater with Peter Weller. Decent movie. If you ever see it on Netflix and got some time to kill, you will not be terribly disappointed. So, nothing to do with the book there. It's just about a big ship. Now his strongest influence, again, was physics. So his goal was to take this sciencey stuff, math, and apply it to philosophy to achieve this, exacting understanding. Now, in terms of which camp he belongs into, he's one of the major British empiricists. So whatever you know about the world comes from the senses. And what he embraces in terms of his metaphysics, he accepts materialism. So he believes that we're material boys and girls in a material world, no soul, no spirit, no ghosty stuff. So where does God fit in there? If there's no souls or spirits? Well, two options.
He wouldn't, would
Yeah, one option, there is no God.
he? Yeah.
Option two, God's made out of,
Matter.
hey, it's made out of matter.
Oh, wow.
He's a material God in a material world. And so Hobbes, he rejects, dualism. So God, if God exists, can't be immaterial, but he does consider that there could be a material God. There should be a good indie band name.
So would that be like, statues, God would have statues and stuff like that, would that fall into there?
Oh, he could be God, but he'd be made out of matter. And so the Greek gods were, for the most part, if you look at the, before gods are generally seen as like humans. They weren't immaterial entities. They were physical, like Athena and and
they
Hades.
interacted with,
Yeah,
people.
they were physical beings. And so you could go back old school, God's like a really big material entity. Now, not surprisingly, even though he didn't explicitly, say there is no God, he was dubbed the father of atheists. Not because his kids were atheists, which would make sense, but because it was believed that his materialism led to denial of God.
Mm.
And he talks a lot about God, but it'd have to be a material God, which is not the standard God. And he doesn't seem to really use God that much. I guess he accepted God enough to avoid being executed.
Mhm. Yeah.
So his ontology consists of physical stuff, and one of his major, among many contributions, is the idea of having essentially a metaphysics of politics. The idea being that just as there are physical systems, physical bodies, which are governed by laws, physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, he wanted to create a political science, which of course we have, but to be a science like physics and chemistry and biology, where you would have, like when you're doing physics, you have all these laws and rules and formula.
Yeah.
He wanted to do the same thing for politics, where you could do like all these equations and none of this like sort of empty speculation, really to make it into
So
a true
equation
science.
for politics.
Yeah, basically mathematize politics.
So, no,
And-
nobody was listening to him then, because this is.
Well, the problem with politics is that we have not been able to come up with we have like some laws. There's like the iron law of oligarchies that basically you always have some rich bastards on top running the show, no matter what. That's true. Every society is a pyramid. I used to joke that Cheops made their pyramid to remind everybody that every society is going to be unjust. There's going to be some on top.
Like,
That's why the pyramids are there, to remind us life is unjust. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a good, because when I was hanging with Cheops, that's what he said. It's a good story. So he wanted to have these equations. When you do physics, we can figure out things like if you want to put a satellite in orbit around Mercury to get some good pictures, what kind of orbits do you need? And we can do that math, and we can put a satellite around Mercury. But we, as you pointed out, we don't yet have equations for politics to work out like what is the equation for, say, ideal distribution of wealth for maximal stability, or how do you predict like political crises?
Well, how did he propose to do this?
What he thought you could do is you could figure out the science of how people work and develop.
You can't do that.
Yeah, you think that thought you could develop systems, because the goal of Leviathan is basically to show how to build a stable society and what you need for that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sort of the ultimate dream of people like Leibniz and Hobbes would be like to turn everything into an exact science. Now, in science fiction, there's a trilogy. Actually, they've expanded it more because after the original by Isaac Asimov called the Foundation Trilogy. And sort of the underlying idea behind that is a science, a made-up science called psychohistory. Not like history like psychos. But the idea being that you could work out, basically a Hobbes plan, you would work out all the equations of how people would act in large numbers and be able to make, you couldn't tell like what each individual would do, but you can make predictions about how the future would mathematically, like how things would go politically. And of course in the story it's sci-fi, so they create the foundation, one foundation that is the empire is collapsing and it's going to fall apart. And this guy Harry Seldon, he developed psychohistory, and his plan is he can, by doing his equations, he can figure out how to cut the Dark Ages back from 30,000 years to 1,000 years. And so he creates two foundations to do this. And then because he can make these predictions, every so often he's recorded them, they go to this vault, and it plays basically his prediction, what he said would occur. And his idea is you could work out like a perfect, psychohistory and predict like how, like if you did something, what effect it would have. So you could do like, if we do this, what would that result in? And to make it an objective science.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to do that yet, but,
Would be nice.
although people would probably do horrible things with it, because they can know how to manipulate and control it. you got, just like with anything, you gotta hope that,
And that's why I asked you, how did you propose to do the equation for politics? Because people, even though his idea was good, the greed of mankind would, but workers.
well, that'd be a factor. You put in that, you put the greed in. To use an analogy, they're able to predict pretty well, not like when I'm gonna die or you're gonna die, but they can predict, like for life insurance, when a certain number of people that when you're gonna die. And so if you have the right equations, you would have like the greed, you figure in like, okay, here's how greed will distort it, here's how ignorance will distort it, here's how knowing about these equations will distort it. And the idea being that just like you do, physics, you take into account like like if people wanted to like try to shoot down your plane, you can work that into your equations. Likewise, if you're doing equations in politics, in theory, you can work in all that, because greed would be a factor. And in a way, we do try to do this because they do try to do the analysis and polling to predict how people are going to vote, how they can, when they do the ads, they're trying to do, political science in the sense of trying to figure out what they could say and do to get people to vote and achieve their ends.
Well, if there's getting any progress on that, why are they not doing more preventive measures on things?
The answer, in a way, you answer yourself because, it's basically people's short-term greed. So what you're trying to do, the goal you're trying to get to, think like with physics. You can do physics to build something that would transport, a plane that would transport people rapidly to hospitals, a helicopter, Or you could use the same engineering and physics to build something that drops bombs on people to send them to kill them. So with politics, yeah, you could work out something and say, well, if your goal was to say, fight climate change, or to create a greater distribution of wealth. But if your goal is to maximize keeping the existing power structures in place, you could do, if you had the equations, you could do them to serve evil as well as good, because it'd just be a tool. So you could sit down and how do we, say like you were in a political party that was losing popularity, but you want to keep power. You try to figure out like what could we do to stay in power even as we diminish in our popularity. And you probably do, try to control the court systems, gerrymander, and suppress votes. And of course with the,
I'm about to say,
Maybe try to eliminate the dissenting political party.
yes, also a good option. But you need them to do the work for you. It's kind of a paradox.
Try and sway some of the people on the other side to come to your side.
Also a good tactic. If we had a science, we'd be able to do all the equations and know how to do that even better. And they're trying to be, the big data thing, they're trying to fulfill, in a way, Hobbes's project, trying to mathematize politics.
so how you feel about, our dear last president trying to use fear tactics to change our democracy?
Well, that wouldn't be a Hobbesian project. That just be basic, basic psychology. That fear is probably the most effective political tool of all. Hope is not very effective, but fear is very effective. Oh, by the way, if you take the critical thinking class I teach, I would say, the saddest thing, very sad thing is that if you want to persuade people, the least effective thing is logic, and the most effective thing is either no logic or bad logic. But yeah, if you're in politics, the way to manipulate people is bad logic and no logic. If you break on arguments, you're gonna lose. Which is why you rarely see philosophers in office. So Hobbes thinks you can do philosophy the following way. First, he calls philosophy what we now call metaphysics. There are the special sciences. He thinks they would be things like physics, etc., that do all focus on those particular areas. But again, as we've been discussing, he believed you could have a political science, a hard science on par with the other hard sciences. But currently, as you pointed out, it's still a very soft, smushy social science, and really not regarded as a science, to be honest, at all. Now, how does he think that humans work? Well, as he notes, of course, we have thoughts, sensations, imagination, memory, etc. And he puts forth an early version of the association. If you had psychology, you might have heard of this particular version. Now, language. Something that comes up as something important we'll see with Descartes as well. One thing that humans can do, of course, is we use language. And we'll see this is very important for Descartes. We'll see that in the future. Now, we talked a bit about the problem of universals. And one of the camps is, of course, nominalism. Now, two camps when it comes to, big camps when it comes to universals. One camp are the realists, not in the sense of like, they're really, pragmatic, but in the sense they believe universals are real.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be immanent universals, transcendent universals, trope theorists. They'd all be in they're real. The nominalists, they say universals are not metaphysically real. Now, nom comes from, not from like nom nom nom, like meaning something, but it comes from nom, like name, like nom de plume. So the nominalists believe that all there is to universals is the name. What do all cats have in common? We call them cats, or in Spanish, gato. What do all humans have in common? We call them humans. So Hobbes rejects universals. He embraces nominalism. So when we're reasoning about stuff, we're always reasoning about particulars. So our language, unlike Plato believed our language corresponds to universals, and Hobbes's view is rather it's our language that divides up the world. So he's an empiricist, a materialist, and nominalist. Now our main focus, of course, is on this metaphysics. And this, part 3 is about, big part about, of course, freedom. Or as Mel Gibson would say, freedom. Now he embraces what is known as determinism. Now here are kind of the options. One option is we're free, whatever that means. Another option is determinism, which means that there is no free will. Everything that occurs is the result of what has occurred before, and there is no free choice. Now this is different from predeterminism, which is that everything has already been set. What is different from predestination, which is a religious concept, that everything is already set, especially being in hell or heaven. So determinism, in a way, determinism and predeterminism end up having the same kind of end effect. But the idea with determinism is there's no chance, there's no choice. To use an analogy, think of like a row of dominoes, one of those really complex setups, where nothing goes wrong. That's the way the world works. You knock one domino over, and it's all going to, one domino can't say, I refuse to fall, just fight it, just happens. So everything that occurs must occur, it cannot occur otherwise. There is no chance, there is no choice. Now you could have a universe that's got randomness, in which case it'd be an indeterminism, in which case there could just be random stuff, like a quantum universe. Now of course, people often think that randomness gives you freedom, but it really doesn't. Because with determinism, you follow a script, you have one option, but with a random universe, you might have multiple options, say 6, but those that are determined by randomness, so you're still not free. To use an analogy, it'd be like in a video game, where you have a character that says one thing. You have it has like one possible response. Then you have a character where there's like a random number generated, and it says that thing. It's still not free. Now, Hobbes believes that we are determined, because we are purely materialistic systems in a world governed by mathematics. So, if you had all the equations, the full knowledge, you could predict human behavior perfectly, if you had perfect knowledge. Now, we do engage in voluntary motions, but for Hobbes, they're just motions controlled by our, brain, as opposed to it's the difference between, like raising your hand and, you know, like your heart beating,
Mm.
or your liver livering. Now, the usual reply to people say is deterministic, that, you know, you could sit down and do all the equations and everything is, there is no chance, there is no choice. But people often say, do we feel free? For example, take a simple example. When you go to a restaurant, you're looking at the menu, and you don't know what you want, what do you feel like you're doing?
Forcing us to make a
Picking
Yeah. You think you're deliberating, and then ultimately you'll make a choice. You'll pick the fajitas, or the Quasimodo
But
with nachos.
for them to, you're still using choice in those, all those scenarios that you use, I mean,
You feel
even
like
with the
you're-
domino, I mean, you chose,
But you're being provided a set of choices.
but still, so mean you're still choosing.
Yeah, you feel like you think you're choosing, because you feel like you're deliberating. You're like if you're there, you're like wavering between like the tacos and the burrito. You're like, I'm not sure what I want, and you feel like you're actually deliberating. That you're making a metaphysically free choice. Like eventually you'll stop and say burrito, or stop and say taco. Now, Hobbes has to explain that, because we think we feel free when we're deliberating between options. We can't decide. Now, Hobbes thinks deliberation is just still deterministic, that you're not really making a choice because the result cannot be otherwise. So if you choose the taco, it wasn't that you chose, you were determined that the taco would be selected.
But
Now, it feels like there is deliberation, but to use a metaphor, you ever been at the beach and there's like say like a log, and it washes up and the waves put it up, and like another wave will come, and you're kind of wondering like, will it be pulled back in the sea, or will it stay on the beach? And of course, that all depends on what is the log choosing.
But that's something different, the law ain't got no mind.
Right. But Hobbes says that our mind works purely mechanically. So it feels like we're making choice, but actually if you had complete knowledge, you would realize that we're like the log, that our deliberation is like the log being washed in the waves. And eventually you'll either stay on the beach or be dragged away, but it's not a choice of the log. But if the log was conscious, it would feel like it was making a choice. You know, like I'm gonna stay here, or I'm gonna go in the water. And we feel like we're choosing, but according to Hobbes, that's like the pull of the tide. Like, the sand kind of grips us, but the tide also pulls us, and whichever is stronger wins. So whether the taco or the burrito pulls stronger, that's already set. You're kind of wavering between the gravitational
So
field.
choice is an illusion.
Yeah, so it's already determined. You will pick the taco, or you will pick the burrito. You don't actually choose. Just like the log doesn't choose, it's whichever pull is stronger. That's what he claims. And again, just because he's Hobbes and he wrote a famous book and died, doesn't mean he's right.
I like the way you put stuff. Or the famous book and that.
He did. He totally died. Yeah, so he thinks that we are not free. Now, despite this, he goes on to give a lot of advice, which is kind of weird, because if you believe everything is deterministic, then in a way it makes no sense to give people advice, because they can't do otherwise. But then I guess you could say, well, I'm determined to do this. Now, one impact of his metaphysics is on morality. Now, there of course is, on his view, no immaterial stuff, so no God. Well, there's a God, a material God. But he ends up embracing, very sort of pragmatic, scientific view of morality, which is essentially this. He says, as a matter of fact, going back to your point about greed, that people are essentially selfish, that they're only motivated by gain and glory. And he says, he's not making any judgment on people, because people must be this way. They can't be any different. They have to be what they are.
Because there's no choice.
Right. And also he thinks, you know, the way to properly do, you know, philosophy is not to sit down, you know, speculate, wish about what might be. He thinks you should do it like science. So look at what do you actually have. And he thinks if you look at humans scientifically, you'll realize that they are what are called psychological egoists and hedonists. They want to maximize their own pleasure and minimize their pain.
So according to Hobbes, what's the driving force? Because there has to be something
Yes.
that,
Two things: gain, we want to get stuff, and we want to get and glory. But the main thing is gain. We want to get stuff. So agree, as you said.
yeah, but it's still that, I'm still seeing choice in that.
No choice.
If-
So you're pulled, yeah, because we feel.
So we're gravitating, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of it, I mean, gravity would be a perfect analogy. Just like when something is, you know, moving between like planets, it can like wobble a bit, but eventually the stronger gravitational field is going to pull it in. And so what seems like decision to you is like something, you know, waffling in gravitational fields, but of course the stronger ultimately wins. And so, yeah, so if you're pulled towards, you know, a choice between like the apple versus like a donut, whichever one is stronger, you know, you feel like you're struggling, but you're like the wave on the beach or like the satellite, you know, the gravitational fields. The stronger one just pulls you in.
So that has nothing to do with our psychological desires or like.
Oh, that is our desires.
urges?
Yeah.
So going towards the donut, even though we don't really have a choice, it would be something that we desire more, so that's why you look toward it?
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah, so it would be, I mean, Hobbes doesn't say you don't, he doesn't say we're like mindless, you know, rocks. But all the mechanics of it would include things like the desires and the feelings, the emotions. But he thinks there's no metaphysical free choice, that we're purely mechanical systems. And so if you understood all the mechanics of it, you would know exactly what people would do, because there'd be no like person makes mysterious metaphysical choice. That wouldn't be in there. You'd see exactly where, just like with physics. If you believe in deterministic physics, you could do all the calculations, and if you had perfect math and perfect knowledge, you'd know exactly where everything would be and where it would go.
So how far did he get with his theory?
He gets super famous, and his theory of, he also developed a theory of justification of political authority. And even today, even in popular usage, people talk about the Hobbesian state of nature as well as the Hobbesian justification for things. So, super influential. And again, he laid down the science of, you know, what we now consider psychology, political science, etc. So, pretty influential guy. Then he died. Still died there. Where's the lesson in there? No matter how cool and famous you are, you still die.
That was another one.
Yep. Or is it? We now turn to our good dead friend René Descartes and Cartesian dualism. Now, Descartes embraces, unlike our good dead friend Tommy Hobbes, he embraces dualism. So, on his view, you have a body, but you are a soul. So there are two substances, mental, and the ghost, and physical, the shell, the body. Now, why think these exist? Well, in the Meditations, which if you take the epistemology class, you'll see, Descartes argues that you can doubt the existence of your body, but you can't doubt the existence of your mind. You know, it's famous, I think, I am. And therefore he believes this proves they're two separate things, because one can be doubted, the other cannot. And in the Meditations, he believes that you end up with these, based on his epistemology, you end up with these two fundamental substances, or so he claims. Now, he thinks that we have minds, and we'll see in the future, the essay, that animals do not. So for him, animals are basically the way Hobbes looks at everything. They're purely mechanical solar systems. Descartes, though, because of his dualism, he believes that we're special. We have, in addition to the physically deterministic body, we have the mind. And this makes all the difference. Now, this is a result of what's called the Cartesian compromise, which is also a good name for an indie band. Now, what he wants to do is reconcile the physics of his day, because Descartes was really liked, physics and mathematics and so forth, and this new science, which was new back then. But he was also a devout Catholic. So he also wanted God, freedom, immortality, morality, etc. And so a big challenge during this time period was, what do you do with this new science, put forth by Newton and Galileo and so forth, with the view that you want to be free and have God and so forth. Now Hobbes said, you just toss that freedom stuff and you just keep the sciencey stuff. And so Descartes wants to compromise. He wants to have a realm for physics and a realm for religion, freedom, and morality.
Everything is split.
Yeah, so you have the body, and this is ruled by the iron laws of physics. Then you have the mind, which is free. That's where the free will hangs out, in the ghost. Now this, of course, creates a classic philosophical problem, known as the mind-body problem. And the problem is this. If you have two fundamental types of stuff, mental substance, physical substance, the mental substance thinks but is non-extended, non-deterministic, free. The physical substance is deterministic, extended, unfree. How do they interact? How does the ghost work the controls of the machine? Now, of course, in movies and TV shows, we see ghosts like grabbing stuff and moving stuff. Although sometimes we see them like, other things can walk through them.
Mm-hmm.
And so how would the ghost control the shell? Now, Descartes considers a ship and pilot analogy, namely that it drives the body around like a ship. But he rejects that for a good reason. Namely this, we could use a car analogy. When you're driving your car and your car runs over a nail, do you feel pain? I mean, aside from the pain of like, what's going to cost me? Yeah, you don't feel what your car, I mean, you can feel like the bump, but if your car like, blows an engine or something, you feel the financial pain, but you don't feel the pain. So we have a special connection with our body because we actually feel the pain. So whatever the interaction is, it's something special. Now Descartes spent the rest of his life trying to find the connection point between the soul and the body. And near the end of his life, the scientists discovered the pineal gland, which is, we've all got one, unless it's been removed, which we do that most of the time. Now, he said, that's it, that's the connection. Now, that still doesn't work because if you point to a particular part of the brain and say, yeah, that's a connection point, that still doesn't tell you how the ghosty soul connects to that physical point. Pointing to a particular point doesn't tell you how that works. And so, never really solved how the ghost drives the ship. Now, of course, to be fair, as we'll see in the future, causation is mysterious, just a weird mystery across the board. So, in a way, one reason why I'm a dualist is because if you think about causation, it's so weird. The idea of a ghost pushing around the shell is no weirder than anything else because it's all pretty weird.
Yeah.
Also, it's fun being a dualist, especially on Halloween. For real. Now, as I mentioned, Descartes, even though he believes that we get the soul, he thinks that animals do not. So to be fair, we of course have to consider, do other things besides us have minds? It'll begin with the critters. Now, Descartes notes that we do tend to think that animals think. Why do we think that, if we do think it? If you've got a dog, why do people say things like, oh, my dog is happy, or my dog is sad, my dog is thinking? Yeah.
Body language.
Yeah, we look at them, and and they are analogous to us. Like, if they step on something, sharp, they make a noise and jump back. That's what we do. If they're hungry, they eat. If they're thirsty, they drink. And so we reason by analogy that we think other people think because we do stuff. Animals do similar things. By analogy, we think that they think. Now, Descartes is aware of this argument and says, yes, it does have considerable appeal to it. He claims that even though he thinks animals don't think, we can't conclusively prove they do not. But he thinks we have a pretty good argument why they don't think. Now, he goes after the low-hanging insects first. Namely, do we think that things like ants and bees and spiders and lice have souls and bodies? Most people don't. We don't think that they get in the afterlife. And so if we accept, he thinks it's weird, it would be weirder to think that worms have souls than to think that the animals don't, so he claims. Now, of course, someone could counter and say, well, sure, I think animals, I think ants have they have little ant souls. Or they could say, well, maybe insects don't, but, higher creatures like dogs and chimpanzees do. Or maybe nobody does.
So how does that tie into the fact that we were talking the other day, one eating the other because they don't have a soul and we do?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, jumping ahead to the end, spoiler alert. One of the motivations for Descartes writing this was because he was discussing with a correspondent of his about Pythagoras. And Pythagoras said that you could reincarnate it as an animal, so it'd be wrong to eat animals because they could have once been a person, and so don't eat animals. And Descartes says one purpose behind his argumentation is to show that eating animals or killing them would be okay, because you would not be committing a crime because they have no soul, no spirit.
Like in the case of an ant, let's just assume that an ant does have a soul. How can you tell that it's different from any other ant? Because from the outside looking in, when we observe ants, all of them behave uniformly. So how is there a differentiation? If the soul is supposed to be the essence of a specific being, like for everybody in this room, we behave differently. We're not all uniform. So if we extend that to ants behave uniformly. So they can't really have a soul, or if they just share a soul or something like that.
Yeah, good point. And there are four possible, or at least four replies. One could be that from the perspective, if there's a being as far above us as we are above ants, they would say the same thing perhaps about us. And we all seem to do the same things, and there's no differentiation. You could say that maybe there are variations among ants that we don't notice. Maybe there are some ants that are, more energetic or braver. Another option you could say is that maybe they are all very much the same, but their souls are so simple that there's not a lot of variation. They do have them, but all ant souls are basically the same. Or fourthly, you could say that maybe each ant doesn't have a soul, but there's a collective soul. The idea of this, there used to be the theory that hives form hive minds, like a collective consciousness. And so maybe each individual ant is like a cell in the body, and then the whole hive would be the entity. There'd be like a soul for that hive. Or maybe they have no souls at all, which Descartes would think would probably be the best explanation. And collective soul would be a good name for a band.
That is actually a band.
I know. They were probably thinking about ants. That'd be my guess.